Well, we talked a lot about the games, but something that was a conversation being had in between games and during games was the reffing standard that we see in this playoffs. And funnily enough, at least at the start of the first round, the conversation wasn't necessarily that the refs were bad. It's that the refs were actually calling penalties. The first few games we saw there was a noticeable uptick, like in the number of penalties called, the number of power plays, right? And we've been calling for that. I think Elliot Friedman reported this, that at the end of last season, there was a meeting that the players had with the league, basically saying, no, we want you to call penalties. Connor McDavid didn't draw a single penalty when they got swept by Winnipeg somehow. And it seemed like they kept that standard up. But the problem is when the refs become inconsistent and they don't maintain that standard that they set at the beginning of the series, not only throughout the entire series, but within games. We saw, we're going to make this, this isn't all about the Leafs that happened in all the series, but we watched the Leafs series more closely, of course. There was a game where, but from the first to second to third period, the standard changed within a game. How is that even remotely fair to the teams, but to the individual players? They don't know what they can and can't do now. So what were your thoughts on, before I go off on another big rant, like what were your thoughts on the reffing standard this playoff so far?
Yeah, no, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, first and foremost, I'm pretty sure statistically it shows that the number of penalties in playoffs stay the same. Just the refs miss considerably more calls. All that is saying is that things get a lot tougher. Players are taking more penalties, but the fact that the refs are putting their whistles away is offset by the fact that there are just more penalties to be called. So I think the number of power plays stay the same. I believe. However, you are correct. Like, they need to be consistent. I mean, there's all this talk about, we don't want the refs to call penalties because we don't want them to decide the game. But what people don't understand is by them not making calls, they are in effect deciding the game.
They are indirectly.
Right? It is incredibly inconsistent. Like we saw Nikita Zadorov not get called for a penalty or a suspension on that play in Game 6.
Frank Glendening in the head, clear to the head.
Yeah, like there is no penalty or suspension there. However, we see in a Game 7, Justin Hall is called on maybe the worst interference I have ever seen. The level of inconsistency there is so bad, and not even because I'm a Leafs fan, but there has to be a level of consistency across series, but at the very least, like you're saying, within a series, like game to game or period to period, it cannot change.
No.
It can't.
No.
Like, why wasn't Austin Matthews given a penalty for that tugging? Remember we saw in like Game 6?
Yeah, Killorn was riding him.
Right?
He was hanging on to his sweater for dear life.
Yeah, I mean, the level of inconsistency is the problem here. If the refs want to put the whistles away, then do it. But just let players know what the standard is and stick by it.
Well, especially in game 7, there were so many penalties. Granted, both ways. The Leafs should have probably gotten called, and Tampa definitely should have got called for a bunch of things. But then they're going to call that when that same pick is set literally 10 times every single game. So if you're gonna call that on Justin Hall, you have to call 20 other penalties the rest of that game. And they didn't, because Bunting got wrecked in the corner by McDonough. Willie got blatantly tripped when we had a 5-on-4. I'm sure there were things that the Leafs did. I remember that Matthews hit on Sergachev probably should have been a penalty.
Yeah.
In Game 6. Like, there's so many blatant calls that they miss, and then to call that in that building to tie the game, that's a joke.
Yeah, I mean, even it's already bad enough if that bad penalty was called in Game 1 in the first period, but Game 7 down 2-1.
It's ridiculous.
Not only do you take a goal away, like you put them on the penalty kill. If they scored on that penalty kill, there would have been riots.
Oh my gosh. Thank God they killed that penalty.
Yeah, thank God. But, I mean, that was the difference maker. We lost 2-1, right?
Yeah.
You're like, Game 7, Andrei Vasilevsky, you're getting nothing by him. The only way that you can score against that guy are with highlight real goals. We saw that with Morgan Rielly. We saw it with John Tavares. Like, you can't take that away. And, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say, I'm a salty Leafs fan. Like, that wasn't a penalty. Was that a regular season penalty? 100%.
Probably.
But with the standard they set in this series, you can't do that.
Yeah. In a vacuum, that's a penalty.
Yeah.
But in the context of what was going on, not only in the series, but that game, that's never a penalty. And the fact that they called that was ridiculous.
Yeah, it just seems like the level of inconsistency is clearly The only penalties that we see in game sevens usually are 4-minute double minors, because you cannot not call a high sticking penalty when blood is drawn.
Yeah.
Right. So for them to call such an on the fence interference call at that time is like, I wasn't even mad. I was so shocked.
Yeah. And let me go full Leafs homer now. When Nick Paul scored that second goal where he turned into Pele with a little kick between his own legs or whatever, if you look, Killorn was holding on to Jake Muzzin's stick when he fell in the corner. Right? There was holding on that play when McDonough scored the goal. I think it was in Game 5 in Toronto. Ross Colton cross-checked Morgan Riley so he couldn't close down that gap. Like, there's so many penalties, and it's fine because you let those go. That happens in the playoffs. We've come to accept that as fans. But then to go back and call the other one is just, what are we doing here?
Yeah, no. So for anyone who's thinking that we're salty, we are not saying the Nick Paul goal should have been disallowed.
No.
Like, that is not a playoff penalty. What we're saying is that sets precedent for Justin Hall's not to be a penalty either.
Exactly. And if we were an LA fan, if we were a Calgary Flames fan, we'd have probably 10 other examples of it in that series. We just happen to watch this series more closely. But I don't know. I think this is the only league, barring the MLB, where the refs are a big story every single playoffs or every single, like, you never hear about that in the NBA because they have the ability to review. You don't hear about that in other North American sports. In football, you do sometimes, but it just feels like the NHL's it's always about the refs doing something to mess up the game.
Well, in every other league, there's precedent being set. Like, the hallmark of a good referee is not one who makes the right calls all the time, because referees are human. The hallmark is that you are consistently inconsistent, if that's the word that I'm looking for. When we look in the NBA, whether a bad call is made on James Harden, James Harden is getting the fouls, so teams can plan around that. When you see an umpire calling a strike zone, like calling the off left portion of the strike zone a strike when it's a ball, if he's doing it consistently, teams don't have a problem with that because they know, okay, let's make an adjustment. In the NHL, you cannot make adjustments when refs are changing their precedent every 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That's the problem that I have. And I mean, it's not going to get fixed. It's just so ironic that the team that it burnt was the Leafs.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of, you talk about making adjustments, I don't know if any other leagues do this, but I know for the NHL, it's not a single refereeing crew that sticks with a series. They change every game, every other game.
Yeah.
Do you think picking a ref combo and saying, okay, you're reffing all 7 games, do you think that might help?
Without a doubt. That's what they do in the MLB. I'm pretty sure in the MLB there is one reffing crew, umpire crew, that stays there the whole entire series. And the players know who these umpires are because they know every umpire has a small different strike zone and they can plan around that. Mm-hmm. But you're right. If they're changing the referees every 3 minutes, like come on. It's just...
I saw a tweet yesterday from a retired ref, Tim Peel. He was like, "Oh, we got Wes McCauley and Eric Furlat, 2 of the best in the game, reffing this one." And granted, maybe they are, but can you just have those 2 ref the entire series? That way, if that's their standard in Game 7, but that starts in Game 1, then maybe you know.
Yeah. Here's the last rant I will have about the refs is that I saw a lot of times, not only in the Leafs series, in a bunch of series, is that the refs that are closest to the play are not the ones calling them. I saw a play, I don't know if it was on Matthews, but that they were right in front of not the linesman, the referee in the corner, and the referee didn't make the call, and the linesman who needed binoculars to see it from the other blue line is the one making the call.
Yeah, I know it optically it looks bad, but maybe sometimes, like, when you're too close, or if they're 2 feet in front of you and you're looking at their chest, you can't really see what's happening at their feet maybe, and the guy at the back has the better view. Maybe that happens from time to time, but optically it does look really weird, especially when it's a bad call.
Yeah, the level of transparency with referees is terrible, and I think the NHL needs to be more transparent about this, but they will never come out and set an official standard for refereeing. Like, that's just not going to happen.
No, but in the NBA, they have... when something happens in like the last 2 minutes, when there's a call made, they have a report that gets publicized after.
Yeah.
But NHL refs never have to answer for their calls.
I don't understand why there aren't reviewable plays for penalties. Like we saw in Game 6, I believe, Pittsburgh versus New York. New York was down by a goal, and Brian Rust blatantly put the puck over the boards on his own zone. It was a blatant penalty, and it was missed. And the difference maker there, it's like, I mean, granted, New York came back and ended up winning the game. Or maybe, correct, I apologize if I'm wrong, maybe this was Game 4 when they went down 3-1. Regardless, I don't understand why you cannot review
Yeah.
penalties with like 3 minutes left, and don't make teams have to sacrifice a penalty for it.
That's a good point, and maybe unfortunately, it always takes something bad happening before the rules are changed. So maybe that's something they talk about. Maybe let's say, okay, last 5 minutes of the third, X, Y, and Z types of penalties are reviewable, or a coach can call for a review and it doesn't count towards their challenge. Like maybe they have a stipulation, because it's not even fair to the refs to have them have to call those penalties. If you have the benefit of video review to lean on, it actually, I think it'll make refs better at their job, because they won't feel as much pressure. They won't, right? They can watch the game a little bit better. And what they can also do is not, like, they can even call a penalty if they think maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, and then have the benefit of video review to go back and say, actually it wasn't, but I made the call in case it was. Like, even just that extra layer of safety, because they're humans, like you mentioned, that goes a long way. We see with soccer, VAR has been used to good effect in most cases.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea, introducing some sort of review over a certain time period, because it's not fair to the teams, but also to the refs on a human level.
Yeah, I mean, in the regular season, it obviously shouldn't be done because the pace of play would be way too slow. But like, teams work their whole season to get here.
Yeah.
To be called on BS penalties is something that just can't happen. I would agree with that as well. I mean, the reason why I think it won't happen is because I think the refs are like one of the most heavily unionized parts of the NHL. And when you give refs an opportunity to look bad by missing multiple calls, I don't know if they would be down to be exposed like that, but it's definitely something that's good for the game. I just don't know if we'll see it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's something, especially if these next few series, if there's more of these instances, I think it's a discussion that they're gonna have to have.